Well, so I started out after my undergraduate program making art, sort of struggling to be an artist in New York City, and moving from doing more two-dimensional work to kind of three-dimensional installations, site-specific projects. But I wanted to kind of take it further, and I thought, okay, maybe I should try this architecture thing. I come from a family of architects, so that's always been sort of in the back of my mind, but from from hearing their complaints about the profession.
Yeah, because I actually do remember you saying, like, growing up, I'm never going to do that.
Exactly. Yeah. And sort of seeing that, and then from the experience of also working in offices, I felt like I wanted to do more than the kind of tracks that I saw available. And I knew I wanted to kind of combine art and architecture. I also cared deeply about politics, and I got interested in preservation and sort of the cultural histories of places and how to respond to that. So I looked for offices where I could do that, and I didn't really find a place that would be a good fit. So I decided to sort of go out on my own and try to make this other kind of practice that I wanted to do. And teaching was always my sort of stable, community and support system for that.
Thank you for explaining that. So what I wanted to tell the audience this evening, what we're going to do is, obviously we're here to talk about Outside the Lines, which is the High's Piazza project for this summer. But in order to more fully explicate that, I think we should look back at some of Bryony's earlier projects in order to get a kind of foundation for this. So I'm going to flip to screen here, and obviously this is a rendering. You can see the real Piazza project, which is behind us now, super exciting. It opens tomorrow, which is great. But for this year's Piazza project, Bryony created Outside the Lines, which she has conceived of as this immersive maze of accessible sensory environments. The project emerged from conversations between the designer and some local self-advocates with disabilities and neurodiversity and their allies, some of whom are in the audience today, with the goal of creating a space that is both inviting and enjoyable for everyone. But as I mentioned, before we talk about this project in depth, I wanted to bring up some of her earlier projects, because of course that's how I got to know who she was, right? Was by her earlier projects. And now this is one that I didn't know, but this is Inverting Neutra, which was at Neutra's VDL house. And for this project, you interjected, we'll say, these colored hanging boards within the kind of voids of the architectural space. And I guess I wanted to start by hearing you talk about this project, because when we were coming up with Outside the Lines, you had joked about it being the kind of anti-piano project. And sorry to all the Renzo piano fans out there, no disrespect, of course, but sometimes you have to use kind of the grand project of architecture as a foil to do something else, right? So if you could let us know, about this project.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you guys see the image okay? I know the light is okay. So, as I mentioned, I'm sort of interested in this intersection between art, architecture, and preservation, and really thinking about how to make work that is emerging from a place and kind of very, very responsive to the physical environment of a place, and then also the people who use it and the people who created it. So this is this incredible modernist house in Los Angeles. It's an amazing project, and they host these installations there. And so for mine, in one dimension, I was like very faithful to the project, because you can see there's aluminum grids that support these hanging strings, and it continues the materiality of the building and the grid lines of the building. But then I introduced these hanging blue cords, which constantly moved in the wind, much like what you see behind you, and also kind of dipped and rose over the places where people walked. So it was all about the kind of dynamism of the life of the place and its environment, which was sort of subverting the stability of that structure. So it was both reverent to the house, but also a little bit, introducing some friction. And I think, similarly with this one, there's this very consistent language of, white tubes, white details, especially around the edge of this entrance. There's a sort of exaggeration of the mechanics of how pieces come together. The joints of things are emphasized in all of Renzo Piano's projects. And it's all about the white. And similarly with Richard Meyer, he was one of the whites in architecture, that's what they call themselves. And so it's all about this sort of purity of form. Everything is geometric and it's sort of unblemished with color or ornament. And so I wanted to take some of those lines and some of that tubular language, but start to twist it and turn it in space and turn it into a dynamic form, and then introduce color and movement and the effects of the wind and of people using the space, so that it would intentionally take it out of the world of abstraction and make it part of our kind of lived reality.
But also your own kind of language, because if you look at the canopies and you look at the seats, they have those kind of cutouts, which for me, now that I've seen several of your projects, are very much like those teardrops, or those like otherworldly kind of shapes are seen like other projects that you've created. And so yes, you're taking the mechanics of piano and Meyer perhaps, but also like adding your own language to it.
Yeah, and they're also the root. That's right. Yeah, the teardrop.
Right. So I'm sad I never saw this project. The next one that I wanted to mention, How to Order from the Chicago Architecture Biennial, which I did not see this performance, but I read about this performance because, of course, I was living in Chicago at this time. And I was super interested in your practice really beginning at this moment, because powerful projects at the biennial this year. And so in projects like this that Bryony created for the Chicago Architecture Biennial, what she was doing was addressing these themes of democracy, spatial justice, historic preservation, and also identity in ways that, as she has talked about, were kind of widely accessible to the public. And I love that it's against the backdrop of the East Van building, which means a lot in Chicago, and also it's the grid. And this is something that we'll talk about as well, as being kind of a part of architectural practice. But this was done in concert with the South Shore drill team. And so I guess my question for you is, like, it's maybe a little chicken and egg, but like, which came first, right? Is it the idea, or did you have the collaboration, right? Like, did you know you wanted to work in this space, or was it the person and then you kind of found the space?
Yeah, great question. And I think, and I'll sort of do a little prologue to the answer, which is that, the Inverting Neutra project was very much about responding to the history of the place through its architect and its architecture. And this was a real turning point for me, because it was a moment when I was responding not only to the architecture, but also to social history of the place, and it's a contemporary social context. So starting to kind of broaden the lens of what architecture or architects can talk about, and the context in which we see something like Mies van der Rohe's architecture. So in this project, the idea of an intervention in that plaza, this like iconic landmark plaza that's all over the grid, this relentless modernist grid, I knew I wanted a performance piece to take over that space and turn the grid into something that was surprising and dynamic and kind of resistant to that system of organization. So in this project, I did sort of think of that and then find the drill team. But in a lot of the other later performative collaborations I've done, it was sort of intentionally the opposite. So find the collaborators first and then evolve. But this is a pretty short time frame, so it was general concept first. And then I love working with the drill team because they're all about systems of order. This performance tradition, it comes out of the military. It's extremely rigorous and precise, and they often perform space and the grid of the drill team. And then as it goes on, it becomes more and more individualistic and expressive, and they sort of transform that space, and then they snap back at the end to the grid. So it was really about sort of teasing out those surprising alignments and as a way of kind of resisting the expectations for that space, the segregation in Chicago public space. This was sort of just after the beginning of Black Lives Matter protests back in 2015. So it was trying to layer a lot of things into a brief 5-minute performance that repeated several times.
And I think you can find it. I mean, if you're interested, you can Google it and find it.
It's on my website.
Oh, and it's on Bryony's website. It's good.
Easy to find.
Okay, so then I think the next one that at least makes sense as a kind of foundational project for this one is your work on soft civic for Exhibit Columbus in 2019. And this was a temporary installation at Columbus City Hall, and it won the Miller Prize in that year. And this project responds to, like the project here at the High, responds to the architecture surrounding it. So in this case, it's the architecture of the City Hall building and its kind of symbolic role as the center of civic leadership in that particular town. So Bryony, for this project, designed this custom fabricated structure with these colorful woven surfaces. We now know that Bryony likes color, and she's activating this public space around the building to very purposefully, as has been written about this project, create a space that was a destination, this is my favorite, for play, performance, and participation. I just think it's so powerful to think about one space being able to do all of these things. I also love the title of this project because it, like Outside the Lines, does many different things. It's not as simple as you think it is. So soft civic refers to the function of the space, right? So it's this place of relaxation and political participation, but it also referenced the material quality of the project. So I wonder whether, to go back to this play, performance, and participation question, like, was it supposed to be like that from the beginning, or did it become layered over time? Like, did you go into the project thinking we're going to do one thing and then, oh, actually, I can add a second thing, or I can add a third thing, or was it, from its initial conception, I really want to go in and do as many things as possible?
Yeah, I think the softness was always there from the beginning, that I really wanted to take this monumental space of government and give it a kind of domestic, intimate feel, so that anyone off the street would feel like, oh, I belong here. I deserve to be lounging or napping, on this space, which is not what civic architecture usually makes you feel like. So there's a kind of political edge to that. And I think at the time, I was also reading a lot and teaching on the history of feminist practices in architecture and art, and the kind of history of making that takes forms of domestic craft and makes it, bigger scale or like public. So it was intentionally taking macrame and these knotting techniques and making them monumental, so that it's sort of transforming what we expect from craft, showing that it can perform structurally and architecturally. So there was a lot of kind of intentional interplay between the textures and the feelings that we expect to have in a home environment, and then putting them in a big public space, and how that kind of rubs up against what we expect from, the kind of symbolic forms of those kinds of spaces.
And for the programming of this, were you involved in that, or?
Yeah. So that was kind of part of the project in a way that I had, similar to this project, I had interviewed a lot of local community groups about how they use the space. In particular, it was about, how is this space of government used? Like, is it welcoming? Kind of events take place there. So I worked with them to think about then how to add more events within these structures that would be performances, discussions, youth days, things that would kind of help the city hall feel more accessible.
Do you think it was successful?
I do. I mean, it was a lovely surprise because we, even before we finished it, we were sort of at this stage, and kids came running up the steps and just threw themselves on this, and it was so satisfying to see. I mean, I didn't know if anyone was going to like it, let alone where the kids would find it appropriate. approachable, and they just immediately were like climbing all over it, and in ways that were sometimes terrifying, but really fun to see.
That's why insurance is their expertise. But we also talked about that concept from this project, is that like kids will find a way to play with anything, right? It doesn't have to be a traditional like swing or slide. It's, you know, the way that their mind operates. It's wonderful, actually.
Yeah, and that actually, that moment was so magical for me that it made me want to potentially design more for children. So the last couple of projects have been very specifically about children and what they need.
Well, luckily, the next one that I brought up will allow you to talk about that a little bit. So I think it's fair to say that for Outside the Lines, Bryony took stock of research that she had been doing for some time. And part of that research was for this project, Restorative Ground, which is a placemaking installation by a feminist design platform called WIP or WIP? WIP. WIP collaborative that Bryony is a part of, and it's opening next week.
Yes.
July 14th, so in a few short days, this will open in New York City. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the kind of intellectual underpinnings of this project, because again, it informed what you were doing for us here at the High. And I guess the larger question is, you know, what were you and the group solving for?
Yeah, I think we formed this group during the pandemic, and for a lot of us, practices were sort of slow, and it was a moment to think more philosophically about what do we want to do, what's needed in public space. That's something that we all care about, is the design of public space. And we started doing these interviews with people, and just kind of like a wide array of different people. And we all care a lot about designing for young people in particular, and we found that public space is so unhelpful and unappealing for so many people. It's just, it's either too empty, there's nothing to do, or it's way too overwhelming and stimulating. And it doesn't feel safe for many people. There's just so many shortcomings. And so we wanted, for this project in particular, we focused on the question of neurodiversity and sensory sensitivity and how to create spaces that would offer a range of experience so that you could choose more directly that you wanted a quieter space or a more such stimulating, intense social space or something in between, or like a focused working space. Because we did interviews with people, Molly from the Global Autism Project, self-advocates that we met in the city, who really spoke about the importance of that variety and choice. And so that was a focus for this project, but really kind of starting this project and moving forward with the rest of the work we're doing, we're interested in that question more broadly about how can we think about the sensory dimension of public space more carefully. And it touches on so many things. It's sort of, now that we're aware of, all of these layers of sort of social trauma coming out of the pandemic, but also just, systematic oppression of many kinds, that there's sort of need for supporting a bigger range of experience than, standard playground or empty plaza. Like, there needs to be more options. Also, people of all ages want to play, and that's something that we want to support in design. So those are some of the ideas that that's kind of a grab bag. But,
No, that's really great. And your comment about people of all ages want to play is so true. One of the reasons why I'm really excited for Outside the Lines to open is because many of us here are looking to hold our meetings outdoors from now on. So thank you for building comfortable places for that. I'm going to advance to the next slide because we're now going to get into Outside the Lines, which is the project that you created for us for this summer. This is a rendering of the elevation, and we're just going to move on to this next slide, which talks a little bit about Bryony's process, right, and how she came to creating this project, which she's already mentioned. Part of it has to do with having conversations across with multiple people in various organizations and others. And so I wonder if you could walk us through, who you spoke with here. And I just love this chart. It blows my mind that, because you are a very like rational thinker, which I obviously have to be as an architect, but yeah, if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So I think, for this project, I was excited to sort of expand what we had done before in New York. And so thinking not only about designing for and with, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, but also physical disabilities. So how could the question of vision, for example, or mobility, somehow also be part of this design process? And in particular, I mean, these conversations were wonderful, and it was kind of a game of telephone where people would say, oh, call this person. Many of them are in this room, and so the conversations kept sort of growing and multiplying. But part of what you see in this chart is just how certain things, certain design elements like texture can be really important for many reasons. So they can be like a navigation tool for people who are visually impaired, or they can be a source of comfort, of like reassurance, or they can be a source of stimulation and, repulsion, for some people. So texture is something that can create different zones of different environments if it's used carefully. And that's something that is very much a part of this piece. But also things like, navigation, pathways. There were all these themes that are design themes that, architects and designers always think about. But all of a sudden I could sort of find these overlaps in these different conversations to how, a texture and material could sort of serve multiple purposes at the same time and create navigation for people who are visually impaired, or they could create a soothing space for someone with autism. They could sort of do a lot of different things.
Can you think of, during the design process, which for me right now is a little bit of a blur because the last week has been quite hectic, but like during the design process when you were going through these, because we have, you have a sketch beforehand and then you go into these conversations, what got refined during that process? What aspect of your design changed as a result of these conversations?
Yeah, that's a great question, because we had to sort of come up with a basic framework before I had this conversation. So there was the thinking about, well, it's probably going to be modular, so it's easy to construct. It has to be roughly sized, to this sort of shape within the plaza. And there was a sort of like geometries I was interested in terms of these circles and these triangles. But then after the conversations, a lot of things changed because the scale was very specific to mobility and to having very comfortable turning radii and clear pathways. The materials changed because I heard a lot about metal chain was not a winning material, and that's what it had been before. But also like the forms became more complex so that it would be more fun as a maze, that you could create a sense of discovery and anticipation in kind of creating more interlocking and tighter little zones where people would really have to kind of turn the corner to find another experience. So it was much more repetitive in the early phases, and then it got more differentiated. Also to create, the two extreme ends are a little more quiet, a little more separate. Hopefully that feels like a place of refuge, and then the middle is a little more social. A lot of interconnected shapes where kids will probably kind of jump from one to the other, and it's where they all kind of meet.
I'm just going to advance the slides. I don't remember what I had on here next.
Oh yeah, this is the process of refinement. Yeah. So I was thinking about these almost like shell-like spirals or something that would be the straight path that starts to turn in and find a little pocket of discovery, whether it's seating or denser straps or something.
I think this one is about the pathways.
Yeah.
And for the pathways, I mean, again, some of it is kind of predetermined, right? Because of the shape of the piazza, and you couldn't change where the parking was or where the sidewalks were. So I imagine that the design didn't change very much based on those conditions, but you tell me.
Yeah, I think I wanted it to be able, and I don't know if it really comes through in the final thing, but the intention was that when you come from either the building or the parking lot, you would you would have a moment of choice where you would see a quieter moment, you'd see a pathway all the way through. So if you're in a wheelchair and you wanted to just pass through, you'd have that option, and you would see a more dense social moment. So you, from either of those sides, you would get that choice. And then I also, late in the process, tilted it at that angle so that it had a more dynamic presence on the plaza.
I remember that as part of the process and thinking, gosh, that's a kind of genius term because I do think it is certainly more dynamic and enlivens the piazza in that way. So thank you for doing that. Let's see what else I have here. Okay, this is just a rendering. Actually here, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the choice of materials that you mentioned earlier. We had, at one point, there was the kind of chain mail, and then you moved to straps, but also the seating choices, and how important those were to this project.
Yeah, I mean, it was so great to hear from the interviews that, you know, about what is going to be comfortable to touch, what's going to work with wheelchairs and not get caught, and also the sound. So we were thinking metal chain, but that sound would have been very abrasive to people who have sort of sensitivity to sound. So we went with something softer, but the struggle with soft things is they have to then be durable and strong, because we know that kids are going to go nuts and do whatever they want to do with this.
Yeah, not just that, but also we gave you the horrific conditions of an Atlanta summer and winter and the rain and all of those things.
Yeah.
So.
And it had to support a 250-pound person hanging from it. So there were a lot of constraints. These could support 400 pounds, not that I want anyone to test that.
No one can hang from the straps.
Yes, you're not supposed to hang. No hanging. The signs are very clear. So anyway, so there's a lot of constraints, but this webbing is actually kind of great because it's like backpack strap or like yoga strap material. It's very durable, you know, weatherproof, thick, and you kind of created these lines that I like. It's like a drawing, you know, but the lines move, so it's a drawing that's constantly shifting.
We're gonna be done with this now. And actually, you just brought up the lines, which references the title of the project, Outside the Lines. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about that, because like Soft Civic, right? It's not just the project's title is not just the face value. There's certainly more there. So yeah, tell us about what the lines mean to you.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a couple different layers to it. There's you know, the fact that the projects are designed through lines, you know, that are lines in plan or lines that are, you know, moving through the sky. But the meaning of the project, like what's most important, is this sort of sensory experience that's really beyond the lines, that's outside of that. It's the way that color and light might influence someone, make them feel the space, the texture that someone feels. So even if they're touching a line, you know, there's so much more going on than just that. And in architecture, we're usually, you know, taught just to draw the lines, but not so much taught about all those other dimensions and how to really work with people to create environments. So that's what the project aims to do. And then also this question, you know, that I heard so many times, or not question, but this problem of you know, communities of people with disabilities feeling like they were given spaces that were separated from other play spaces or other public spaces, that there were these sort of invisible lines or sort of visible lines, you know, between them, and how important a sense of, you know, integration and connection and interaction is. And so the project is really trying to kind of weave together all these different environments that might appeal to people, so that they can actually mix and sort of be next to each other and interact, but it's very subtle. There's no labels, you know, for what, you know, where someone is supposed to go. It's all open.
I want to go back to a moment when Bryony and I were in Marietta at the Fabricators, called BLD, did wonderful, wonderful work this week. And we were looking at the yoga strap, calling them yoga straps, is how they are, like shorthand. And deciding between color, right? the right colors. And had come here, we were looking at various yoga strap colors in the piazza, in the sunlight, and then bringing it back to Marietta, and then not finding the right ones, right? And part of it is a production issue, but the other part of it is an aesthetic issue, right? Because you want these colors to kind of be able to communicate with one another, and then also to have multiple colors. So I'm wondering if you could maybe tell us a little bit about how we finally got to where we are today, and also this idea of the multiple layers to the straps, because I think that was a really ingenious way of getting additional texture and additional depth that wasn't necessarily part of the project at the beginning. At the beginning, it was just like, I think it was just single straps.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we were hoping at the beginning to find straps that we could buy that would be those colors. But you can't, this comes back to those constraints again, because you could get that in nylon, no problem, right? But that's gonna stretch over time. It's gonna not do well in the rain. It's gonna, so
if someone swings on it, right?
Not strong enough. So, there are all these things that meant that it was yellow, orange, red, white.
They were so ugly, guys. They were so ugly.
Really bad colors. And I couldn't sleep at night thinking about that. So Taylor and his crew, many of whom are experienced with spray paint for various reasons, came up with this idea to spray paint them. And
it was genius.
It is genius. And they're really good at it too. I tried it, I went in to do the test of colors, and I did like some templates for them, but
yeah, I did. I think I recorded you doing it. You were like very careful about it, very purposeful, and they were, they just have more experience.
It's clocked a lot of hours.
Yeah.
Two of them in particular. So it's very cool. They've got like all these ways of angling it to get the gradient. So I just was like, okay, I'm gonna do this to the pros.
Yeah, and I think you just said like, I want it to be, ombre or like whatever, however you described it.
Yeah.
And it magically happened.
Yeah. And we managed to get the colors that we wanted.
Yeah, miracle. I mean, not really a miracle, but we worked with someone who had the tools to be able to kind of produce it.
And was willing to try a lot of new things that were not in the original plan.
I'm going back to this idea of outside the lines, because what popped into my head was an early conversation that we had about, I don't know whether you had dreamed about a roller coaster or we had talked about it. Yeah, and only after you telling me about this idea of a roller coaster did this then start to make sense. So I wonder if you could share that little story with us.
Yeah, I feel like every project has its sort of inspirational images, like the little kernels of something that.
Did you do like a mood board?
Well, so my husband's here, he can attest that we in my studio, there were just all these images of roller coasters, and I just love them. They're beautiful.
Like old roller coasters.
Oh, yeah.
Old
roller coasters, like the Coney Island, beautiful old like white structures, and they're crazy shapes, and the science of roller coasters is amazing. I did like a Google, rabbit hole and then pulled back out, but I just think as drawings they're amazing. And actually it was wonderful seeing the Calder Picasso show, because that's so much what that work is about, and I hadn't thought about it in years. Like, of course I studied that work, but you see Picasso turn the bull into just like, and with Calder he's doing it in the air with sculpture, and it's so inspiring. They're masters of that,
Yes, and we're masters as well, because we planned the Calder Picasso exhibition at the very same time, and so you can see the connections. No, I'm kidding, but it was the happenstances.
Yeah,
it makes a lot of sense. So I am going to ask people to get ready with their questions, because we are nearing the witching hour. But while people are getting ready with their questions, both via Zoom and also in person, if you have a question in person, you can raise your hand. I'll ask one to kind of kick things off. And it goes back to, again, a conversation that we had in the spring. You can imagine that with projects like this, there are highs and lows. many times over, and yeah, we have had many conversations. But at one point earlier in the spring, after the design had gone through multiple permutations, we talked about this idea of letting it get uncomfortable. I don't know if you remember this.
I don't remember.
Okay. Yeah, hopefully I will be able to remember this, but especially when thinking about architecture, right? This idea that you use the grid so much in your practice, and in your previous projects, and especially the projects that we showed tonight, the Chicago Architecture Biennial and then Soft Civic. And we just, yeah, we had a conversation, and I was just like, well, sometimes you just gotta let it go. But you're a perfectionist, right? And so that's why it's really hard to let it go. And so I wonder, is it okay that you let some of that go? And how did that approach maybe benefit this project?
Absolutely, and that was like a gold star carrier moment, I've got to say, because Monica was
I only had one, and that's
sounding, there were many, but real like conceptual sounding board for this project that helped me think differently. Because I think in architecture school, you're trained to always have a system and always have a logic behind everything. In art, there's a lot more freedom, and I'm kind of stuck in between. And so there's a risk when you go off grid, and it becomes more gestural and more loose. And this project was going that way, and that was uncomfortable.
It freaked you out.
Yeah, but then I realized that was actually where I want to go, because it was coming from an understanding of experience and sensation. That was leading it more than a grid that had been determined ahead of time. So it was like thinking about how big of a space people would want, and how they would turn, and where they would move, and having a more organic organization to the thing was the whole point. Yeah. So it's actually going to set me off in that whole new direction, I think. So I'm very grateful.
I'm happy about that too. Wondering if anyone has any questions in the audience. Oh.
Thank you so much for explaining the process of your work and doing that.
I'll repeat the question. It's more the sound of work in progress.
My question is, I'm in the field of design, and I've always been fascinated by architecture and its relation to structure. But what parts of building this culture piece that was inclusive of disability do you think you could take away from the building environment? I mean, other than elevators or infrastructure.
Yeah.
So I'm just kind of curious.
Can you recap your question?
Sure. Yeah. So the question was, what about this process and this project could be used to inform the built environment more broadly?
Great question, Grace. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think two things. On the one hand, it's process, which is something that I think more and more architects are becoming open to, is kind of processes of co-creation and collaboration, learning from people whose lived experience they're supposed to be designing for, and maybe designing with instead of designing for. And so that's one thing. But then on the other hand, more concretely, I think what we're trying to do with this WIP collaborative is think about the design of public spaces on kind of a planning and policy level as well, to think about evaluating that and their accessibility, not only in terms of just a ramp, but what is the sensory environment of the place, and how could that start to be measured, and what kind of prototypes that you introduce that would create pockets of different sensory conditions. That's something that we're working on. That would be outdoor public space, but I think in terms of the internal built environment, the same kind of logic could apply. Thinking about differentiation of materials, lighting, sound conditions, not building open plan offices, that kind of thing. Yeah, I think it's there. There's some work on that already, but I think maybe more pressing would be great.
Any other questions in the audience? So kind of building on Grace's question, making your art accessible to all has obviously been important to you, and as an architect, it makes sense. Was there something that was kind of a catalyst to making that important? Or is it something that's always been, even in your youngest days as an architect, something that you've always tried to incorporate, or was there kind of something that happened in your career where you thought, I really want to focus on this?
That's a great question. Yeah. Oh, sorry, recap. Was there like a moment, like a catalyst moment that made you interested in the issue of creating accessible environments? Is that a good recap? Yeah. So I think a lot of the work is around accessibility more broadly, like trying to get design out of a world of elite, ephemeral, or not ephemeral, esoteric kind of realm, and make it something that everybody can come and enjoy. And focusing on play is one way of doing that. And so I think like the Chicago project was about like who can access these public spaces, who feels like they belong here. Thinking about gender in public space, like soft civic was also how can kids feel at home in a government space. I think that for the sort of question of disability, it was a combination of things. I mean, for the collective that I'm a part of, for us, it was something that we, I'm trying to think about the best way to talk about this, but I think a lot of us had like varying degrees of sensitivity ourselves, that we felt like we struggled with public spaces, even if it wasn't something that has been diagnosed, but that we totally resonated with a lot of the shortcomings we were hearing about. And so I felt a lot of personal drive to do this. In terms of family history, my father was in a wheelchair at the end of his life, and so I have vivid memories of trying to navigate public spaces with him, and it just being, catastrophic. So it's sort of an accumulation of different things, and certainly the interviews that we did made it so clear that this is such a visceral need that just became a big motivation for us. That's kind of grown the more that we talk to people.
And if there are no further questions, I would ask one final question, which is, what's next? What are you working on?
Yeah, so that project opens in New York next week.
Yeah, that's already done, so.
It's already done, true. Well, it doesn't feel done. We're still like, where are the drainage holes? Where's the sign gonna go? But so we're part of a team that was shortlisted for a large permanent park in Jacksonville with a large public art project that I designed. And
fingers crossed.
Yeah, so it's 3 teams, and we're hoping we get that one. And then with the Developmental Collaborative, we're working on more of these sort of large-scale urban planning policy questions of design public spaces in New York City, and collaborating with these 2 great groups there at the Sydney and the Bronx Independent Living Services. So they sort of work with groups with disabilities to rethink public space. So that's a long-term, multi-year process of working with them on that.
I hope you get all every single one of them. Oh, very nice. That was a perfect ending. That's good.
From the project as a bachelor in New York, you can see some like inspiration and experience in this project.
It's just a great out.
What do you think will influence your next project, if anything, like this, and what you learned, if you, I didn't literally just read up, you might like change your mind and a little bit more, but I'm curious if you like anything that you want to take with you to the next project.
Yeah, I mean, I think that key moment. Oh, sorry, the question was, is there anything? The question was, is there anything that I want to take from this project moving forward? And I think that moment of discomfort was really important and really liberating for me. So as a designer, I think there's a lot of ways of making shapes and making space from this that I want to do a lot more with, and I'm like actually just kind of like itching to like make some messy models when I get back. And I mean, it was really meaningful, like talking to the people in this room and the other community partners, like really profoundly meaningful to learn from their experiences. And that is for sure going to influence all the future things that I do. And yeah, I took a lot of notes, so I'm going to definitely reference them again.
Thank you. Thank you, Bryony, for creating a wonderful project for us this summer that everyone can appreciate and experience beginning tomorrow, July 10th, through November. I'm blanking on the date, but it's the 20-something, so it'll be on view for a very long time. So please come and experience the Piazza project. And I want to thank you for creating a wonderful project and also for this conversation. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.